This is a very special semester of Global Voices, but honestly, this is the one that I've been looking forward to the most. A few years ago, I wrote an article for Evangelical Missions Quarterly on the value of African Americans in missions, because it's something that I believe in, praying for, and we have done some things in the Global Center over the years that have really been for the purpose of encouraging this. But honestly, nothing as compared to what has happened in the last year. Gabby came to me last year and she suggested that we use some extra funds that we just so happen to have available to send some people to the National African American Missions Conference. And I thought that's a terrible idea. No, I thought that's a great idea, as many of her ideas are. And so I've just been amazed at the feedback, and I'm not going to step on anything that they have to say, so I'm going to let them share about all of that. But I am so happy to have Devante back. Give everyone please welcome Devante back to Birmingham, back to Beeson. He is a Beeson Divinity School graduate, and so is Armstead Herndon. Please welcome Armstead back. Gabby Watts, you know as my now former program assistant. Now she's events coordinator at Beeson Divinity School. She did too good of a job at program coordinator, and so anyway, she has a new position, and we still love her just as much, and we're so thankful for her being here. And now I'm just going to hand it over. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Parks, for having us. You guys don't know it yet, but you have three very extroverted people here on this panel, and we are very excited to talk to you guys today. Most of you guys know me as Gabby, but for those of you that don't, hi. I'm Gabby. I'm from Chicago. I went to Auburn, majored in hospitality, and I have an amazing husband, Andrew, who's actually here on the front row. And I just love missions, very passionate about it, and super excited to be here with y'all today. Armstead?
Okay, and I'm Armstead Herndon, May 2019 graduate of Beeson Divinity School. Earned the MDiv. And, after 7 long years, don't let it take anybody else that long.
And one of our first 2 mission certificate graduates.
That's another reason why it took me 7 years. But this is the Birmingham area is my home, so I attend a local church in the area. I've been a member of a local church pretty much all my life. Other than I spent half of my life in the military. So retired, come back home, and never thought I'd end up at Divinity School, but here I am. Here I am this morning.
Yeah, so my name is Devante Anderson. I'm just so thankful to be here. I recently graduated from Beeson, actually the same class that Armstead graduated May of 2019. Right now I pastor a church in an area called Sheppard, Alabama. It's in the Muscle Shoals, Florence area. The church is called New Bethel Ame Church. Other than that, I serve as a mentor to kids. I've mentored through many programs like Give a Kid a Chance and the Boys and Girls Club. So I pastor, I mentor. And for those who don't know, I'm also a rapper. I do music. So, having a lot of fun. But I'm just so thankful to be here.
Yeah. So our topic today is African Americans in missions. And we're definitely going to talk about that. But we also want to share with you guys about our experience to NAMAC, which is the National African American Missions Conference that we went to last summer, because it was very catalytic for all of us on the stage. And I think it really just informed us a lot about the African American history and missions. But before we start, please let's begin in prayer.
Let us pray. Most gracious and merciful Father, Lord, we just come before you right now, God. Just want to say thank you, God, for allowing us to see another blessed day. And God, we thank you for your grace and your mercy, which keeps and sustains us. And Heavenly Father, right now, we just pray that during this time, Lord, that this time will be used to glorify your name. Lord, may it be used to encourage. May it be used to teach. Lord, may it just be used to share, the rich history, the rich Black history that we have, Lord, as far as Black people on the mission field. But Lord, may that be used to show that, Lord, although these people were oppressed and treated as second and third class citizens, yet they were still able to do so many things to the honor and the glory of your name. May that encourage us, Lord. And may it be used, Lord, to guide us, Lord, so that we might be able to do similar things, things, Lord, that you are calling us to do right now. So, Lord, we just pray that you will have your will and have your way. And these things we ask and we pray, Lord. Amen.
Amen. All right. So how we're going to kind of format this discussion today is that we're actually going to start with talking a little bit about NAMAC. And all three of us had some experiences that we had in regards to missions before we went to NAMAC. And it just kind of shifted through that conference. So we wanted to go ahead and share those first.
I can start. Yes. I got the NAMAC pretty much because of something everybody here will probably have to do, the History and Doctrine series. At the point where I began to write about my denomination, to write about my faith. And National Baptist, USA. But in writing about my own faith history, I began to realize that the convention that I was a member of, the National Baptist Convention, was first named the Baptist Foreign Mission Convention that started in 1880. And their goal was to send missionaries to Africa. They weren't the first to do it, but the AMEs were actually the first who really started doing it. But because of that History and Doctrine series and having to write probably a 15 to 20 page paper, you have to start digging and you start finding things out. And I began to discover a lot of things about my own heritage. Began to discover a lot of things that I had not been made aware of, I had not been taught, and you might as well, if you don't know it, you need to find out about it, okay? Well, bottom line, the next thing I know, it's the deeper I dealt with my own convention, the mission certificate program began. Well, I decided then to approach Dr. Parks about becoming a part of the mission certificate program. Lo and behold, did it, got involved in it, and one of the first things I did was spend about 6 to 7 weeks in Liberia, West Africa. Sort of thought it wasn't very comfortable about going to Africa, had been around to other countries, never been to Africa, and believe it or not, the last assignment that I would have had I stayed in the Army, I really had to get out, I got too old. But had I stayed in the Army, my next assignment would have been a place they call Hoa, the Horn of Africa. Didn't make it, I got out. And lo and behold, here I am now going to West Africa with another Beeson alum. Some may know the name of Dennis Agray. He hosted me during that entire period that I was there. One thing, as I said, I was a little uneasy about it, but guess what? I got to Africa, and pretty much most of what I did, I lived like I did in the Army with generators and filtered water. So it really wasn't a big, it wasn't the nightmare that I thought it may have been. But the conveniences of Alabama, some of those were just not there. Bottom line, they were just not there. But again, having some experience in the military, it wasn't an issue with me to live with a generator, live with filtered water, and then get accustomed to a strange diet of rice 3 times a day. But the one thing I noticed about being there were a lot of other mission agencies present in West Africa, a lot of them. I began to meet people from other mission agencies, but one truth was there and in my face. Other than what was called the Carver School, the Carver Academy in West Africa, in Liberia, West Africa, the other agencies were all ran by European Americans. Not that they weren't doing good work. They were absolutely doing good work. A person I met from Oklahoma with beautiful feet took me to a Muslim village. trying to start a relationship with the Muslims. Took about 30 or 40 pounds of rice with him. And today, to cut the story short, today they gave him roughly 50 acres of land to use for beautiful feet to start evangelizing that Muslim village. I stay in contact with him on Facebook. And I just seen the progress that he built a home. They helped him build a home there. So these are the type of things that prompted me to want to continue to explore West Africa, and then as an African American, to explore what part we play in missions also.
So part of my introduction to Black people on the mission field actually started with my denomination. I'm AME, that stands for African Methodist Episcopal. The Ame Church was the first Protestant church started by people of color. It was the first one. And the interesting thing about it is that during a time where America was fighting for their independence from the British, you still had Black people treated like second and third class citizens. Okay, but even through those obstacles, men like Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, they came together in the late 1700s, actually the 1790s, they started the Ame Church in Philadelphia. And while they were starting the Ame Church, the Ame Zion Church got started in New York. Later would come the CME Church and all these other churches. But the interesting thing about these churches was is that because they were found through such obstacles, they honestly believed that they could do anything. I mean, when you are able to start a denomination in spite of oppression and racism, I mean, their faith and their belief, they really did believe they could do anything. And this would lead to them wanting to go and do missions in not just Africa, but in all parts of the African diaspora. So South America, the Caribbeans. So as early as the 1820s, you already have Black people dominating the mission field. They dominate the mission field in Africa. They dominate the mission field in the Caribbeans. And not only do they dominate it, they want to do it. While slavery is going on, you actually have this happening. Even so much so, one person in particular, Scipio Beans, in 1827, he gets ordained at an annual conference. And right after he gets ordained, he requests to be sent to the West Indies so that he can plant more churches. So they dominate the mission field, and this goes on for years, even during the Reconstruction era and the Jim Crow era. And it wasn't just Methodists, AMEs, AME Zions, and CMEs. It was also Black Baptists. A lot of Black Baptists were there present too. Even some from Alabama, William Sheppard and Lucy Sheppard, both born and raised here in Alabama. At Stillman College, the library is named after William Sheppard. They would actually accomplish a lot of the missionary first in the Democratic of Congo. I say all that to say that when you look at the history, yes, it's rich. But when you look at now Black people only make up 1% of the mission field.
Man.
How did we go from dominating to making up only 1% of the mission field? You got to look at what happened in the 1920s. A lot of racism was going on within missionary agencies. They didn't want to send Black people of color anymore because of colonization in Africa. Also, as you start getting towards the 1950s and the 1960s, the civil rights movement, all the agencies that were pretty much owned by Black people, they started pulling people back because there was so much work to do here at home. And if you even ask people today now, if you ask many African Americans right now, like, have you ever thought about missions? They'll even tell you, we got too much work to do right here. That's always their excuse. I got too much work to do in my own backyard. So it was so cool to be able to go to NAMAC, and the whole that's the reason the fact that Black people only make up 1% of the mission field is the whole purpose of NAMAC. The purpose of NAMAC is to encourage young Black people to be missionaries, at the same time set it up to where you can have people with more experience supporting them and able to send them to go. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Gabby. But like I said, that's the purpose of NAMAC. It's to fix this problem that Black people only make up 1% in the mission field. And how can we, get it back to where we have more people going?
Yeah. And talking about that absence of it just being like 1%, that's kind of like where my kind of story of missions comes into play. I have always been interested in missions, and I've had the chance to go on several trips. I've been to like 14 countries, but every time I went on a trip, there was a common denominator for me. I didn't research my history because I didn't think we were interested in it as like a race. I didn't think African Americans cared about missions, because every mission trip that I went on, I was the token Black person. So I just created this mindset of, oh, well, that's just not what we do, just out of ignorance and just not knowing what you don't know. I even dug deep to find some old pictures of some of these examples. So this first one is college years. Y'all don't judge me. But I went on a trip in Brazil, and I was the only minority on that trip. And that was like one of my first mission trips. So it really kind of shaped my idea of how I saw missions. I went to Niger a couple of years later with another group, and same thing. Now, we did have one other guy who was Latino that went on that trip, but both of us together were still like, there's not a lot of us here. And even recently, I went to India with my husband, and the same thing. There was not much diversity on these trips. So when I was thinking about missions, it just kind of created this mindset in my mind that missions was really an opportunity for like white Americans or a superior culture to go to an inferior culture and teach them something. That is what that created in my mindset. And so how did we end up at NAMAC? Like Dr. Parks mentioned, I brought the idea to him, and how I got there was me and my husband, we have fallen in love with this ministry called Perspectives on the World Christian Movement. And a couple of you guys have taken that course or been a part of our course. We love it. We think it's a great tool to just give people information in regards to missions, but also help mobilize them. And so we had taken this course, fallen in love with it, and we wanted to become coordinators so that we could teach it. And we went to a training session in Orlando, and one of the regional directors said, hey, we love your passion for missions. How can I help you do whatever you need to do to just support Perspectives or support you on Sanford's campus as you're bringing this class here? And the first question that came to mind, I said, can you explain to me why there are no African Americans? Like, even in this Perspectives course, there was a lack of diversity. Even on the coordinating team, there was me and then there was an African. And so I was like, what is going on? Can you explain this to me? And he said, you need to go to NAMAC. And I said, what is a NAMAC? And he was like, it's the National African Americans Missions Conference. And I was shocked because I didn't know we had one. I was like, we have one of these? And he was like, yes. And so I came back and I told Dr. Parks, I said, we've got to go to this if we can. And like he mentioned earlier, we had conversations, because that's something that we had noticed was just the lack of African American engagement in missions, and how can we change that? And so when this opportunity presented itself, we jumped on it, and I asked these guys and several other students to come join me. And we picked them kind of strategically because Armstead and Devante both have like a passion for missions, and Devante's a pastor, and he's always said how he wants to know how to make his church more missions minded. But then we also had David Austin, who's a pastor as well, that wanted to learn, like, okay, because his whole thing, and he mentioned this in the podcast, was before NAMAC, he thought, I can't go overseas because there's so much need right in front of me. So he actually went to NAMAC to prove his point right, and God totally ended up wrecking him and changing his mind. And then we had Connor and Misty, and they went, and I thought it was so beautiful because they said, look, we are working with campus outreach, and we do not want to be ignorant to the needs of like our fellow missionaries and African American students that were interested in missions. So they went there just to kind of learn and be engaged by it. And we all loved it. Like Devonta hit on earlier, NAMAC, its whole vision is to see African Americans and multi-ethnic churches just mobilized for global missions. And one of the things that really caught us while we were there were all of those breakout sessions. And I've highlighted some of them, and you guys can chime in too. But I loved it. The first one we went to was Where Was All the African Americans, which we will get to. But I loved it that they had something for everyone, no matter where you were at in your missions journey, so to speak. Like they had understanding the basics, but then they also had things like how do you finance mission or how do you get a disinterested church in missions, which I thought was really cool and really unique. And before we go into the history part, do you guys want to share some things about your experience at NAMAC?
Well, hopefully we have enough time. I brought this was the 10th.
No, it was the seventh that we went to.
Seventh, yeah, the seventh annual conference. So thank you for correcting. But although Gavin mentioned just a handful of the different breakout sessions that they had, but I just wanted you to just listen to some of the others. What do I do when I get there? And these were like 1 hour, 30 minute breakout sessions. As Gabby mentioned, where are all the African Americans? Building a missions ministry in a disinterested church. Missions and spiritual warfare. Catching the mission vision. Missions, marriage, and family, all are welcome. Again, there was that was just the first day, that Thursday that we were there on June 20th. There's also a NAMAC certification program. It was for the interest of those who wanted to go further into missions training. By Friday, we were dealing with Missions 101, understanding the basics. What is missions? Why is it important? What keeps us from executing the mission vision? Reaching the nation among us, ministering to refugees and international students. Again, catching the vision for mission vision, but this was called institutional funding. How to raise the necessary funds in order to have successful missions, whether short-term, long-term, whatever the case may be. And that was just a few. One other, well, some of them were repeated on a daily basis in order to give individuals time to try to attend at least some variety of the different types of breakout sessions. But they were all extremely informative. There were people from Africa, Kenya. We went to an early morning prayer meeting, and I met a lot of people from West Africa, North Africa, East Africa. Not as many as there were from, say, from the United States in general, but this group was still drawing people from all over the world. And another thing that they were doing was the missions, youth missions breakout. They had separate classes, separate activities that would allow the youth to be taught missions, to share interest in missions, just to bring them up to be, I guess you want to say, to be missions minded.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that. That was one of my favorite things about the conference, but also was the fact that when you were in the high school level, not only did they teach you how to evangelize, but the students actually went out into the city in DC and shared the gospel with people.
Yeah.
So it was an opportunity for them to be interactive in that, and they loved it. Speaking of the highlighted workshops, so let's get into the history of African Americans in missions. I know that you kind of like alluded to a lot of things, Devontae, but I really want to take the time to not assume that everybody is kind of up to speed on that. So let's talk about where all the African Americans, like let's go from the pioneers that we had to the hindrances to the inward turn and the challenges that we're facing now.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier, and I will say this, one of the great things about NAMAC for me was it reassured me and it confirmed everything I already knew, that it reassured me in the importance of Black people in the mission field. One, because like I said earlier, it's inspiring just to know that in spite of slavery, in spite of Jim Crow, in spite of the Reconstruction era, here they are doing amazing things, raising money to send people on the mission field. But another reason why, and this goes to anybody who is struggling with, am I called to do missions? One interesting thing about Black people is that they are confirmation that you don't necessarily need the missionary call to be a missionary. A lot of people feel like I have to be called to be a missionary in order for me to go and do missions. And according to this man named Dr. Herbert Kane, he says there's no such thing as a missionary call. He looks at it as more as God's guidance. And Black people are proof of that. When you look at how a lot of Black people ended up on the mission field, it was really just God's guidance, God leading them there. So, for example, George Lyle, even though he doesn't get the credit he deserves, he was actually the first American missionary. A lot of people don't know that. The first American missionary was a Black man. George Lyle became a missionary in Jamaica because he was trying to escape slavery in Georgia. So literally God guiding him there. And he did so much great work in Jamaica. But then also he became a Black loyalist. Now, Black loyalists, these were people who they were promised by the British that if they helped them to fight against white Americans, that they would be given land once the British won the war. They would be given land or whatever. But here's the thing, though. Of course, the British lost, but they had to keep their promise. So to all of those Black people who fought on the side of the British, what they ended up doing was this. It was about 5,000 of them. They ended up moving them to Birchtown, Nova Scotia. Okay, and their conditions were horrible. There was no farming land. You have about literally 5,000 people in a small island trying to use the farmland, and they couldn't do it. So when their first opportunity to go to Sierra Leone came, they went back. And then naturally, as they went back home to Sierra Leone, they just started planting churches. Planting churches everywhere. As a matter of fact, one of the capital of Sierra Leone is Freetown? Freetown.
It's the capital.
Yeah, because, like here are free men able to come back to their homeland. But they naturally planted churches. They were guided back. Even today, for those of you who know who Lecrae Moore is, he's a famous Christian rapper. Lecrae is proof that you don't need the necessary missionary call to be a missionary. Back in 2010, Lecrae went on a mission trip to Sudan just because he knew that his album was going to be successful and he didn't want to become big-headed or cocky. So he used that opportunity to go on a mission trip and to do work in Sudan. So whether it's a rapper, whether it's Black loyalists, free men who fought for the British so that they could, earn land, or, George Lyle, you look throughout African-American history and you see that Black people are proof that you don't need the missionary call. All you need is God's guidance in order to do mission work. So, it's just very important that we not only acknowledge the history of Black people on the mission field, but that we try to continue that legacy because they do have a great part there.
Mm-hmm.
And also during that same period of time that Devonta was speaking about George Lyle, there was another individual, an ex-slave named Lot Carey. And George Lyle actually had been a missionary some 10 years before. We all know the name William Carey. We all know that name very well. But George Lyle had been on the mission field 10 years prior to William Carey. And then comes Lot Carey. He was actually killed at a young age. Well, to me, it was a young age, 48. In an explosion in Liberia, West Africa. But he had devoted most of his life to serve as a missionary in the Liberia, West Africa. So these were things that were going on about at the same time that most people mistakenly thought that William Carey led the way as far as missionaries. But now there are two other men, two ex-slaves, mm-hmm. who actually were doing things before and at the same time that William Carey was being known for his work in India.
Yeah. And then also we have up there Betsy Stockton, and she is the first single woman missionary in the 18th century in the modern mission era. And it was really cool because she was a slave as well. And when she got her freedom it was quite remarkable because, Devonta alluded to this, you don't need the stereotypical call. All of these people, if you read their bios, they talk about this encounter moment they had with the Lord. When they met the Lord and they got saved, everything shifted for them, and it was their passion to share that with everyone else. That's what fueled their calling. And the same thing happened with Betsy. And so she got saved. When she got freed and she got saved, she actually still lived with her masters for about 10 years just because of the way the laws were at the time. And she bought her freedom, so to speak, but she was a paid slave. But she got educated and she wanted to go to Africa, but she ended up in Hawaii. And she ended up building a school there and teaching and creating a place for just the students there and the children there. And then she still wanted to go to Africa, but because of just medical things or something like that with a friend of hers, she ended up in Canada somehow and ended up building a school there for children and taught Native American children. So it's just really beautiful, the rich legacy that we can look back on and see. And there are countless and hundreds of names that we could just give you, and we clearly don't have the time for. But there is a beautiful heritage that we have. There's a huge legacy that we have in missions. But how did everything start to shift? So we're going to have to fast forward through this because I see the time. All right, so we're going to move into like hindrances. So things that hindered just African Americans in missions. Obviously, you've got these pioneers that are just still doing what the Lord has called them to do, and their passion in sharing the gospel despite slavery, and even at the risk of being enslaved again once they're free. And then you move down the years and you get into like the colonization period, and you want to speak to that?
Yeah, just briefly. The Carver Institute in Atlanta, Georgia, they still support missions in West Africa. But there is a person that they've written about it, they've done research on, named Montrose Waite. Waite. W-A-I-T-E, I believe is correct spelling for his name. But Montrose Waite was somewhere nearly about 100 years ago or less, has been in Africa, had served in Africa for a number of years, took his wife there, had children there, came back home on furlough, and what he wanted to do was just to rebuild finances and get back to Africa. Well, one thing had began to start happening because of colonization in Africa by a lot of European nations. A lot of the European nations were suspect that these black missionaries, African-American missionaries, were stirring up the people, the Africans, stirring them up to try to avoid colonization. And as I remember correctly, there were only two nations in Africa that weren't actually colonized, Liberia and Ethiopia. But the remaining nations in Africa, at some point, they've been colonized. The Dutch, the Spanish, the French, the English, everybody played a part in trying to colonize the continent of Africa. The one thing that did happen in the nation of Liberia was the American Colonization Society around 1818 to about 1821. They actually were bringing freed slaves back to Liberia, West Africa. And there was a lot of friction between the freed slaves and those, the so-called, they would be called nationals, the ones who still had never been brought into slavery. And unfortunately, there was frictions. There were friction because some were looking at the Africans as being just another color of a slave master to them. So that created a lot of friction in that during that particular time. But they got over it, though. They got over it. They began to work together. From my experience in speaking with some of the people in Africa, they always spoke of Liberia as the star of Africa. Liberia led the way. It adopted a constitution similar to that of the United States. Its flag is similar to that of the United States. One big star, and it was called the Star of Africa. They used it as the Star of Africa. And unfortunately, as life would have it, civil war just pretty much brought Liberia down to its feet.
But no. I'm glad you touched on that. And so we've talked about like colonization, but also other things just moving down into like the generations. You're hitting like segregation and racism and civil rights movement. So you have all of these things that are just kind of pushing against just the momentum and the passion and the desire for African Americans to want to work in missions, to where it gets to a point to where there's so much chaos and there's so much pain and wounds that have been built that there's this inward turn that happens, to where it's like, how can I go overseas when there's so many things happening right here in my own country? And the motto turned from missions minded to survival minded. Like, we have to survive this. And we can't focus on other people when we don't even feel safe in our own place. And so those are major things that kind of like tip the scales in African Americans participating in missions. And then that's just when you see this huge drop that happens. And then also, even after that drop, things that didn't help it was you still had like slight racism in certain agencies. And so when they went, there was this movement or momentum, I can't remember what time period, where agencies were going to specific universities to like promote missions and get people excited about missions, but they didn't go to African American schools or colleges. So there's a whole generation of people that just kind of missed that whole wave. So we say all this because that's just kind of like where we were, and there was an inward turn, and then it still affects us today with the current challenges that we face in African Americans participating in missions. There's a lack of education, knowledge towards it. You have people that don't even have their basic needs met, or they don't even feel safe in their own country, that they can't even imagine leaving. A lot of churches have this just unhealthy mindset of, there's so much work that needs to be done here. Mm-hmm. You know, we can't even think about going over there. And so why we want to share all this is because when we were at NAMAC, they talked about all of these things, but they also celebrated like what God is doing now. You know, it's like, okay, so there was a lot of stuff that happened and it wasn't good, and God is healing and God is restoring, but let's get excited about what he's doing now. And they brought up things about just showing how like things like NAMAC have been created to mobilize and encourage African Americans in missions. For me personally, I think that whole experience that we went to was so catalytic because it was like a homecoming. Like, it was the first time when I went to a space and I learned about my history, but not only learned about it, but also celebrated it, you know? And felt proud. I didn't feel like the odd man out. I didn't feel like the token African American that was interested in missions. I felt like I was a part of a big clan of people that was interested in missions. And I've got this legacy and this heritage in missions that I didn't even know about. And so now I'm empowered and I'm proud and I just want to tell everybody else about it, you know? And that was the effect that it had. And it was amazing. And we are so off this PowerPoint. But we're like going to skip forward because I do want to we want to leave time for like Q&As. But I mean, I showed you guys pictures of me on mission trips in the beginning where I was like the token person. And that was my idea of what missions look like. And now it's this. Right. It's every, it's like, I mean, it's not, it's blended and it's beautiful, you know? And not only that, because I know we want to touch on this, that heritage and the unique influence that African Americans can play in missions, you know? I thought it was so cool how when they talked about these sessions and they talked about going overseas and things like that, they always highlighted the unique things that us as a culture can bring to the mission field, that we can identify with struggle. And that sits with other cultures, you know, that we are culturally flexible, you know, like we're adaptable, and that we blend in, which I thought was so beautiful and so unique, you know, because there's a lot of things in our life, especially African Americans, where they feel like they're not good enough based off the color of their skin and things like that. And then you put it in a missional context and it's actually a win, a huge win. I can go to Brazil, I can go to Spain, I can go to India, and they will think that I am them until I open my mouth. You know, like we can go to Africa and we don't stick out like sore thumbs. Like, I mean, it's a beautiful thing. Sorry, I get a little excited. Do you guys?
But trying to stay in line with it, there was one thing one phrase I brought home with me from NAMAC. It was both and, not either or.
Yeah.
Both and.
And that was the thought of, we can say locally, well, pastors in churches say, well, I just can't do it. I just don't have it. But the NAMAC put that thought in my mind. It's not just, it is, it's not, it's both. It is really both. This is what we're called to do. There's no way around it. And it can be done. There was a pastor who spoke at NAMAC. I probably don't have his name.
Philip Nelson.
No, it wasn't Nelson. It wasn't Carl Ellis. He was a pastor in Maryland. And he's in one of the breakout sessions. He devised and he gave us a handout called How to Establish a Global Mission. A global vision, I'm sorry. How to establish a global vision in one of the breakout sessions. And he was one that was really, really stressing the fact that you start with the church leadership. You start there and you start teaching. Sunday school, Bible studies, you start teaching missions. And you just teach it, and you teach it until your people just get on fire with it. But Devontae, we got to run out of time.
It's our time. It's our time.
So the whole theme of that conference that we went to was catching the vision, the missions vision. And I think that that's probably like our hope for you guys. Like I think our prayer up here and sharing this information is that it just lights a spark in you, you know, that it encourages you, that it informs you about like where African Americans were in missions, but also that it encourages you to learn more, to know more, to participate more. Go to a NAMAC conference. It will change your life. I don't care what race you are. It will profoundly change you. But also to just really be prayerful. You know, there's a long way that we have to go with African Americans and their engagement in missions. But it is encouraging to see the emergence of Black churches sending people on short-term missions, having African American mobilizers, you know, these networks that are growing and that they are building. And so definitely just pray that God just keeps continually, well, we know God's going to keep moving, but let's just pray that people are obedient to keep walking in that, you know, and responding to the nudges and the shifts that he's doing right now.
His name was Dr. Kevin Wilkins.
Thanks for bringing it back for us. So yeah, I know we don't have a lot of time left, but we did want to kind of just open it up to see if you guys had any questions on it.
I'm going to give you the microphone for the questions so that the questions themselves can be recorded, please. We have to one of
Oh, sweet.
How long has NAMAC been around?
Yes, so this summer, 2020 will be its 8th conference. I think it was actually started by Pastor, what is it, Perry?
Perrin.
Perry?
Perrin?
Yes.
His name is Bishop Perrin. His name is Bishop Perrin from a church in Maryland.
And they coordinate with David Platt's church to host
Right.
this event. So it's hosted at McLean Bible School. But he just saw this absence, and he really wanted to engage not just his current generation, but the generations to come in missions. And so it's really beautiful to see how it's grown. If you want more information on NAMAC, if you just put in naamc.org, it'll really give you like the vision and the background history on it.
Was there any particular literature that you guys encountered at the conference that you would like to suggest to us, or any organizations that were there that are putting together international and global missions for people of color?
Yeah.
Sowing Seeds of Joy Ministries. They were there. RISE was there. Though that acronym stands for Relational, Intentional, Strategic, and Evangelistic. Actually, I have the Bible League was there. They sent this to me after they sent that to me after I left. There were several universities there.
There were.
Also, several universities were at NAMAC, and their purpose was to, believe it or not, they were there to try to recruit students. And I think Beeson am I getting a little ahead of myself? Beeson may have a presence.
Oh, yeah, hopefully, which would be great. Yes, hopefully Beeson will be there this summer. To answer your question in regards to literature, though, there is Profiles of African Americans in Missions. That is a perspectives book. And what is the second one?
African American Experience.
African American Experience.
African American Experience.
You can purchase both of those books on missionbooks.org, I believe. But we also have them conveniently in the Global Center.
Right.
Also, also there's if you want to just read more about the history of African Americans on the mission field, there is a Century of Missions of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, written by L.L. Berry. And then also Mark Ellison, he wrote one called, Mark Ellison wrote Changes in African American Mission, Rediscovering African Roots, Journal of Research in Crime and Delinquency. So those are two if you want to check those out.
Okay, so Gabby, you mentioned a couple times like the perspective you had of like missions of like us being privileged, like going somewhere else that's like maybe underprivileged. So how do we, and I think that's something like I've experienced a lot too, interacting with people. So how do we help like change the perspective and kind of help people understand like the blendedness of missions?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I wish I had this like perfect answer for you on that, but I don't. I'm still unraveling that myself. One thing though that I really try to do is when I think of like trips that I want to go on, or if I'm engaging or having conversations with people about missions, I am trying to hit everyone. Does that make sense? Like, I have this really sweet Vietnamese friend named Con, and I rave about missions to her, I don't limit myself in my thinking anymore of who I should talk to about missions or who I should even ask for support when I'm like fundraising in regards to missions. Like, it's just educating yourself and not being exclusive, but inclusive, and just invite everyone. And maybe people that you have in your life that you're like mentoring or you walk in close relationships with, tell them about it. Share those things with them too. I think a lot of that change is going to come in the context of relationship. Because I think in relationship, there's a trust built there, and people are more open and more willing to hear what you have to say. So I hope that answers your question.
I guess I want to address your question. You haven't had missions. Okay. You'll get an answer.
You should tell us the answer.
Will be answered in missions with Dr. Parks. Because that was one thing that we talked about. When you go into these areas and in order where we're not presenting ourselves as being privileged and looking down on them, don't go in there with a prepackaged solution to their problem, but allow them to be a part of their own solution.
Yeah.
And that makes a world of difference.
So I had a friend that I went on a mission trip with a few years ago, and she, like you mentioned, Gabby, in your own experience, was the only African American on the trip with us. She was really passionate about missions, and that happened to her frequently. But one thing that she shared was like her frustrations of just the perceptions that even people in these other countries all over the world would have of her as an African American, and how that sometimes became like a negative thing, or people even in Asia or Africa or Latin America, already had a negative perception of who she was because of the color of her skin going into these other countries. And so I guess I wonder if that has something that you guys have experienced in your own travels and how you have dealt with that or would encourage other people, white or black or whatever, to address that in their own travels in the mission field.
Well, let me say one thing. If you get a head of white hair and you go to West Africa, they will call you Poppy. And you get clout there, believe me. West African culture, they really honor their elders. And I was probably one of very few men. I'm in my first trip there. I just went last year, so I was nearing 70 when I went last year. And I can't hide my white hair anymore. But it's if you want to call something privilege, well, that is a real privilege. That is a real privilege. But they really honor age. And there weren't very many men my age walking around. The Civil War in Liberia probably had a lot to do with that. Men not living to live a long life that I've been blessed to have. But men pretty much were scarce. And elder men were pretty much scarce. So it was, I enjoyed being called Poppy.
To try to hit on your question, as far as racism on the mission field, I mean, yes, it's true. It seems like the darker the skin, anybody who is of lighter skin, there's always racism towards that. You see that in Asia. You see it in, of course, Europe. You see it everywhere. As far as African Americans, though, it's so interesting because there's even racism between African Americans and Africans. A lot of African Americans have bought into the lie that that white people went into Africa and just saved them from savagery. They were living in the wild, and they just saved them from it. At the same time, a lot of Africans have bought into this lie that black people in America, they're all from the hood, they all want to be rappers, and there's a lot of people who actually believe this. And I mean, there is real racism between Africans and African Americans. I even heard one African say that I wouldn't let one of my kids marry y'all. Why would I let her marry, a descendant of a slave? So I believe one thing we can do to kind of help with racism as far as black people on the mission field is basically what we've been talking about, understanding the importance of black people on the mission field, and understanding why we need to support. I heard one person say one time, he was talking about how, I don't know why black people are complaining about how they can't get support on the mission field. I can't get support either. I was like, okay, but imagine this. Imagine if you as a white person are having a hard time getting the support, how much harder it must be for that black person trying to get support. I think one thing we can do is first understand black people's importance on the mission field just as much as everybody else. Everybody has a place on the mission field, no matter what race or ethnicity you are. And then upon that, supporting, doing whatever you can, whether it's teaching, learning, listening, whatever you got to do, to help those people, whoever they may be on the mission field. And I'll even say this quote right here. I heard this in Global Voices one time. Somebody said it was a black man who carried Jesus' cross on Calvary. It's going to be black people who's going to carry the cross to the rest of the world.
Man.
I'll just add to that. One of my dreams is that there will be Beeson Divinity School graduates, African Americans who are called to missions, and there will be other Beeson Divinity School graduates who are pastors of churches, white churches and other churches that support those missionaries.
Yeah,
that would be pretty amazing. All right. It's time for us to wrap up. Please give them your applause.